Hello everyone, Mason here. How are you doing? Today it's time for a book review. Allow me to tell you a story. In a world known as the internet, there is a place they call Booktube, and in the land of Booktube they hold reading in the highest regard. People gather to discuss and share their opinions. They talk about what they've read and what they're going to read. They host read-alongs and readathons, reading sprints and buddy reads. It's a happy place, a friendly place. One day, a man named Mason arrived in the land of Booktube and decided to stay there. He quickly learnt their ways and made many friends. Eventually, Mason began to hear one name time and time again. A grim dark lord by the name of Joe Abercrombie. Many people recommended the grim dark lord's work, but Mason refused to read them. "That doesn't sound like it'll be for me," said Mason, with a shake of his head. "I'm not much for fantasy." "But Mason, you love the Lord of the Rings," his friends would say, but Mason would just shake his head and tell them that was the exception to the rule. Next, they would tell him about the characters the grim dark lord would craft. "Seriously, Mason, they're so fleshed out. They're morally ambiguous with complex motivations. One of them tortures people and he's the most likeable character." It was no good. Mason just shook his head stubbornly. "That doesn't sound like it'll be for me," he said. "I like characters that are nice people, that do nice things and help their friends." The people who lived in the land of Booktube sighed in exasperation. They knew Mason was a hypocrite. After all, he claimed to like nice characters, but his favourite genre was the crime thriller, and one of his favourite stories was Sweet Pea, whose main character is an absolute psychopath. One person in particular did not give up, because she knew Mason better than he knew himself. There is one they call the nerdy narrative, the very heart of Booktube, and everybody knows her name. Eventually, the nerdy narrative's persistence broke Mason's willpower. A deal was struck. In return for Leslie reading Sweet Pea, Mason would read The Blade itself, the first book in the Grim Dark Lord's first lore series. This is how Mason learned. He is a bloody fool. Say what you want about Mason in the Dark, say that he's not a fantasy guy. Yes, The Lord of the Rings is my favourite series of all time, and when I first started this channel I expected to be diving into new fantasy worlds left, right and centre, experiencing different magic systems every 5 minutes. However, I quickly realised that I'm much more partial to the crime, thriller, mystery side of fiction. I like stories that are grounded in reality, and because of that, up until when I read The Blade itself, Mistborn Era 1 was the only fantasy that I'd read this year. I'll be honest with you guys, I didn't expect to like The Blade itself. If I'm being brutally honest, I didn't really want to, because I wanted to be different and cool, stand out from the crowd. It was an ego-driven desire. You've got to be realistic about these sorts of things. Unfortunately for me, I am every bit as predictable as my partner jokes that I am. And so I'm here, and I'm going to give you my thoughts on The Blade itself. As someone who isn't particularly fond or familiar with fantasy, I have to say that Joe Abercrombie does a pretty good job when it comes to world building. It feels like he gives you everything that you need to know without ever overloading you. It never feels like he's just dumping a load of description on top of you. The dangerous empire in the south, the cold and barren north with its feudal nature, the melting pot of Aduar and the Agriant, a city in which nobility and poverty live side by side. The Blade itself is intensely character driven, and that definitely helps with the world building. Abercrombie never goes out of his way to just tell you about these settings. You learn about them because the characters that you're following live there and they observe their surroundings. It doesn't really matter where in the world these characters live, each place seems to have its own challenges and its own dangers, whether they be physical or political. It seems to be a hard and harsh world, filled with brutal landscapes and brutal people living brutal lives. Of all the characters, only one of them seems to have had an easy life. Everybody else has had to scratch, claw and fight to be where they are, and yet he is the most ungrateful, the most pompous, the most self-absorbed. Each character is drastically different. They all have their own motivations and their own perspectives. They see the world in different ways, and yet each point of view is equally interesting in its own way. I don't mean this as a criticism, but it is something that needs pointing out. Plot-driven readers may be turned off by the Blade itself, because truth be told, not that much happens. Okay, there's some skirmishes, some violence, some political manoeuvring and even some investigative work, but this is a book filled with setup. It's the first book in a series through and through. Abercrombie takes the time that he needs to set up the characters and flesh them out, and I'll admit, for the first third of the book, I wasn't that interested. It felt like it was a little bit aimless. Then, slowly but surely, character by character, one by one, Abercrombie got his hooks in, ensuring that when things did start to happen, I already cared about the characters involved, and when it ended, I wanted to know what's coming next. As I said before, it never feels like Abercrombie just dumps information on you. It all comes in drips and drabs, bit by bit. One of the things that I found extremely impressive was the skill with which Abercrombie uses the characters to give us varying and sometimes opposing perspectives. I'm not usually a fan of stories with so many different points of view. I don't feel like it gives you enough time to get to know any one of the characters in particular, but that was not the case for the Blade itself. Each character feels so real, so fleshed out and individual, their motivations so clear and understandable, that even if you have a favourite to start off with, and yes, for me that was Glockter, eventually there will be something that interests you about the others. It's so interesting that Logan is the stuff of legends. The Bloody Knight. So many people in the North know his name, and yet he's not particularly proud of his reputation. He's a battle-scarred, hardened, brutal warrior that's seen so many battles against friends and foes. He feels lucky to be alive. He's simple-minded and yet somehow strangely wise with his whatever happens happens mentality. I found the fact that each time he survives a situation he repeats the mantra "I'm still alive" pretty damn entertaining. The same can be said about the other common phrases he repeats that you become familiar with throughout the course of the story. The wonder with which he views certain situations, such as the events that take place with Bayaz, and his perspective on Adua and the other characters, is engaging and entertaining at the same time. The character development that takes place towards the end of the book is so intriguing. It left me with so many different questions and lots of different theories. Towards the end, there's a pretty damn violent action sequence, and I have to say action is something else that Abercrombie does very well with. The simplistic clarity with which he describes fight scenes is immersive, easy to picture, and easy to follow. For want of a better phrase, it's bloody awesome and a lot of fun. Then there's Glockter, and what do I say about him? For a man that was a prisoner of war, who's been tortured and now tortures other people on behalf of the government, as a man who's in constant pain, who is a miserable, apathetic bastard, he's somehow hilarious and strangely relatable. From the moment that he's introduced, hobbling his way to an interrogation, complaining about the amount of stairs in the building, thinking about how much he'd love to torture whoever invented them, asking himself why he does the things he does, I was totally intrigued. His snide, snarky remarks and the things that he thinks about people whilst he's talking to them are always so funny. His attitude towards life, the city where he lives, the people around him, and even himself are always so cutting and sarcastic. It's brilliant. The thing is, he's also quite a tragic character because life is hard for him. His body is broken in so many different ways. He's in constant pain to the point where he's not quite suicidal, but he is intrigued by the idea of his own death. In a way, Glocta is a razor-sharp example of disabled representation and how people view disabled people. Glocta was a man that was held in high esteem, that had respect, and yet the way that he sees himself and the way that other people see him has changed. Where people once saw a skilled warrior, they now see a pitiable cripple that is uncomfortable and gruesome to look at. They judge him on his physical appearance and don't notice the sharp mind inside the broken body, which, to be fair, is to their own detriment a lot of the time. Admittedly, he's not what you typically think of when it comes to disabled representation, because people tend to want disabled people to be cast in a positive light. But guess what the grim dark truth is? People discriminate, even against themselves. Life isn't always fair. Some disabled people have a negative self-image, especially when their disability stops them from doing things that they want to do, things that they used to do, when it stops them from having the quality of life that they wish for. At the same time, others can be condescending with their pity. They can dismiss disabled people, resent them even for making them confront something that they're uncomfortable with. And as a disabled person, I appreciate that being a discussion that we can have thanks to Joe Abercrombie. In my opinion, Glocta has all the best lines and most of the best scenes. He kept me engaged and entertained at all times. He's miserable and self-deprecating, but also extremely quick-witted, cunning, and far more clever than most characters he interacts with. He hates the world and he hates himself. To be honest, I've been watching House recently and it's hard not to draw comparisons between those two characters. Finding out about his backstory was interesting and emotional. There's actually a particularly heartfelt scene towards the end. I also enjoyed watching him as he tries to unravel the mysteries that are presented throughout the story. Yes, he does investigative work, and yes, that definitely made me like him more. On the other hand, we've got Giselle Dan Luther, a man who's had an easy life by all accounts, a captain in the military who comes from a place of privilege and has his sights set on high places. He's abrasive, arrogant, obnoxious, egotistical, judgmental, lazy, conceited, shallow, selfish and snobby. He's a pretty crappy person, if we're being honest. At the same time, his perspective is valuable. We need a character who comes from the comfortable upper class of Adua so that we can become familiar with how it works without being given a tinted, jaded explanation. All the other characters are from much different, much harsher environments where survival is an active challenge. Even Glocta, who is from the same place as Giselle, knows what it's like to struggle to survive. He knows what it's like when you fall from grace. Through Luther, we get to see what life would have been like for Glocta before everything happened, and that's an interesting parallel that gives both men some depth as they interact with each other throughout the story. Here's the thing when it comes to Giselle. Despite all his faults, he's still an interesting character, and throughout the story he does show signs of growth. Moments where we see that he has some actual humanity, actually has a heart. It's clear that he's getting ready to undergo some sort of transformation, even if the winds of change are dragging him along, kicking and screaming. To be honest, I don't feel like there's too much more I can say about him without giving any spoilers away, and whilst it might seem like I've given a pretty two-dimensional description of him, I have told you everything that you need to know to start with. I'll admit that, on the surface, Logan and Glocta are more obviously interesting characters, and I invested in their stories a lot faster than I invested in Luther's. I do have to say though, Abercrombie took me by surprise with the directions in which he takes Luther. There was unexpected twists and turns, despite the fact that I thought I had it all figured out early on. He definitely caught me off guard. I have no idea what's in store for Luther later in the series, but I want to find out. There are other characters involved, actually quite a few more, but I don't really want to talk about them because I feel like it's better to encounter them as the story actually progresses. I don't want to give anyone's significance away before it's actually meant to be revealed. What I will say is, I don't feel like there's a flat character in the whole cast. Everybody has potential for the future, even if they're not quite as fleshed out as others by the end of the first book. There are so many crisscrossing lines of influence and motivation. There are so many characters that are just off on the fringes, just off stage behind the curtain, ready to be brought forward and placed in the spotlight. I can't express it enough, all of the characters feel alive, and that's helped immensely by Stephen Pacey in the audiobook. I don't think there's any other narrators that I've encountered this year that show as much skill, variety and depth as Pacey shows in the Blade itself. He is unmatched. This becomes more and more apparent as the story progresses and more characters are introduced. Not only does he imbibe these characters with personality and emotion, there's a wide variety of accents that he employs that make them all feel individual. A pompous drawl, a broad northern accent, Cockney, Geordie, Brummie. There are so many different British accents at play here, and Pacey performs them all brilliantly. There's no better example of this than Glocta. Pacey does an absolutely phenomenal job when it comes to Glocta. The lisping voice that he employs embodies that character perfectly. It works perfectly. And not only that, there are subtle touches too, like the fact that when Glocta talks out loud he lisps, but his internal monologue does not, and I love that. When I say that not much happens, I feel like I'm doing the Blade itself an injustice, because whilst it's technically true, it's not accurate, if that makes sense. This is the first installment in a series. The entire point is to get you invested and interested enough to keep on reading, and I think it works perfectly for that. I actually feel that the Blade itself is pretty accessible, because Joe Abercrombie doesn't throw you in at the deep end and bog you down with details, but he also doesn't hold your hand and spoon feed you. He doesn't say, here's this world I created, here's all these names of places that you'll never remember, now care about it. At the same time, he doesn't go out of his way to give us clunky explanations about the world. All the information we get we learn through the eyes of the characters. They are living their lives and we drop in one day and start following them around. I feel like if he'd have dropped me in and just expected me to care, I wouldn't have, because I'd have felt overwhelmed. Instead, he focuses on delivering a character-driven story with interesting, fleshed out characters that feel real, gives you time to get to know them and gives you reason to care about them. Whilst he's doing all of this, he's also dropping hints about the lore, the history, and what's to come in the future, doing so in a writing style that's accessible, easy to digest, and feels blunt at times, but that works perfectly. It's funny because one of the things that kept me from trying this book sooner is that grim dark label. I expected it to be full of gruesome, disturbing material that felt like it was there purely for shock factor. That isn't the case though. Whilst it is gritty, there is cussing and most certainly violence, it never feels like it goes too far, it never feels over the top, and in fact a lot of the time it has a light-hearted, humorous, jovial vibe. This isn't an idealistic fantasy world, it's not pure good versus pure evil. Each character is a mixture of both. They have flaws, but they also have motivations and reasons for why they do what they do, and that makes them feel more real. I want it noted and on the record though, I don't trust Ardy West. She does seem like she's supposed to be a good character, but my gut's screaming, don't trust her! Yeah, that's how my gut speaks. I'll be honest, this review is outside my comfort zone. When it comes to fantasy, I'm not an expert. I don't feel like I know what I'm talking about, and I don't know why people would take my word for it. At the same time, is that not proof that this book is good? I don't even like fantasy that much, and I really enjoyed it, so how much are you gonna like it if you love fantasy? This one's gonna grow on me, I can tell. I only finished it 48 hours ago, and I already like it more than I did then. I want to know what's next. I want to know what happens to the characters. I want to talk to people about it. It's safe to say that I definitely recommend the Blade itself. Is it going to be for everyone? No, but some people will love it, and it will become some people's favourite series. That I can say without a doubt. My question for today is this. If you could have a highly intelligent, highly trained, maybe even magical animal companion, what would it be? I've got a soft spot for bears. I think that they're just cute and cool at the same time. I think it'd be awesome to go on an adventure with one. When it comes to fight or flight, I am most certainly the latter, so I think that I'd choose a black bear, because then if we're going on an epic quest and we get into a dangerous situation, we can just run away together. For those of you who have read The Blade itself and want to discuss spoilers, I will be providing a spoiler thread in the comments section. If you've enjoyed this review, the like and subscribe buttons are just sitting there, waiting to be pressed. Now press them, or I'll be sending my black bear friend round to see you. If you want to get in touch, say hi and have a chat, you know where the comments section is, and the link to my Twitter can be found in the description. Thanks ever so much for spending time with me today, guys. Until next time, take care. For now, I'm off, and you should have a good one.